Today I'm going to speak about the 2 to 10 year timescale component of CO2 variability. This is the time series from Mauna Loa, Hawaii, from the Scripps CO2 program. And it's well established for the long-term secular trend, the relationship between fossil fuels, deforestation, and the growth rate being balanced by sinks. And similarly, at the annual cycle, there's been recent work to show by Heather Graven that there's an increase in the amplitude and that there's both potential contribution from climate and CO2, and recent papers also by Gray and also by Zhang suggesting that there's a direct anthropogenic control on the CO2 amplitude increase by agriculture and agricultural intensification. And I'm going to focus on the middle timescale interannual variability, and in particular look at the relationship between human and indirect climate and controls. So there's been some really nice work recently examining variability in the CO2 growth rate and its relationship to temperature, a paper by Wang and PNES showing that the CO2 growth rate is actually very closely linked with temperature. And the mechanisms appear to be that when you have a temperature increase in the tropics, it both suppresses primary production through several different pathways, and it enhances decomposition. In contrast, precipitation controls on CO2 variability appear weaker because there's less, because both of the responses are synchronous, and they lead to, in response to drought stress, a decrease in primary production and a decrease in respiration. And in this study, fires are actually are secondary in a residual term. More recently, in another analysis, a different Wang showed that the growth rate variability is actually increasing. And then over the last several years, Peter Cox and colleagues, in a recent paper by Wenzel, show that you can use the CO2 growth rate variability to constrain the long-term Earth system model land feedback in the tropics to 2100, and that some of the original models may have had too strong they have too much variability in the growth rate and sensitivity to temperature, and they may have overpredicted the sensitivity of carbon loss in the tropics by 2100. So I'm going to focus on, in contrast to the really recent work suggesting that it's really net ecosystem exchange and its response to temperature and precipitation that's driving the CO2 variability. I'm going to focus on two mechanisms, additional mechanisms that are more directly linked with human activity. One is tropical forest and peatland fires and their modulation by El Nino and other climate modes, and then fossil fuel gradients that are increasing and their interaction with interannual variability in transport. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to try to ask the question of how does the growth rate, the sensitivity of the growth rate to surface air temperatures in the O&I region change on a monthly timescale. So to examine the role of fire in a really nice analysis Gretchen Keppel-Aleks led, she took advantage of the two-dimensional structure of atmospheric carbon dioxide coming from both latitude and time. And what she did is she created very simple net ecosystem exchange anomaly models where the model is driven by anomalies in temperature, and it's adjusted over the land surface using annual mean cycles for temperature, knocking out places where it's below freezing, and also where there's deserts. Also the same thing for drought, where you have a drought anomaly, Palmer drought stress, and you're modulating the strength of this by the spatial pattern of mean annual net primary production. And these were then transported through geoschem to create these CO2 basis functions, and they were all normalized then to 1 petagram of carbon interannual variability. And then you could linearly add these to see how much of the variability you can explain in different latitude bands. And the idea here is that there's been recent work to show that there are climate extremes by Jacob Zeischwender and Marcus Reichstein, and sometimes these climate extremes will push a CO2 pulse into one hemisphere or another, and you can use that structure to help you with the attribution process. And so this is work from Gretchen then that shows if you look at, this is the correlation of these simple models, temperature-driven model, drought, fire, going from left to right, and then more complicated models, and where you combine a couple of these different terms. And so the complexity of the model is increasing, degrees of freedom are increasing, but if you look at it from an AIC index, the more complex models still are able to explain more of the variability and more of the information content given the increase in degrees of freedom. So temperature is a dominant control, but so is fire, and drought is also. And there's more of the variability you can explain in CO2 in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Most of the global, so this is if you run with global fluxes. If you just confine your atmospheric fluxes to the tropics, again, you can explain much of the variability in the extratropics. However, the contribution of the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere is much weaker. But for fires in the northern hemisphere, there's actually a significant contribution, especially in the northern part of the northern hemisphere. So if you construct some simple models with fluxes where you're optimizing a single term from the tropics and northern hemisphere, you can come up with some optimized models. And one of the best performing models, best estimate, is a combination of temperature, drought, and fire. And you're able to explain up to about 80% of the variability in the mid-latitudes of the southern hemisphere. So this is a summary figure of this analysis that leads to a slightly different conclusion than some of the work published last year in PNAS, and that is that temperature is, tropical temperatures are an important driver of the CO2 growth rate variability. However, when you add the contribution from drought and fires, the combined influence of drought and fires is actually larger than the direct temperature influence. And the tropical, in the northern hemisphere fires in Siberia and North America have a larger influence, and they drop as you go to the southern hemisphere as expected. And tropical fires tend to have a larger influence on CO2 variability in the southern hemisphere. So this was just published this week or last week in Global Biogeochemical Cycles. If we think about the fire contribution over time, this is really elegant work by Robert Field, Guido van der Werf, and their colleagues that was published in Nature Geosciences. And what's shown here is this is the GFED fire emissions time series derived from remote sensing data. This is an airport visibility record. And they match almost perfectly during the period of GFED. And so during El Nino events on the island of Kalimantan, you have very large fire emissions from this human influence and from draining canals and the escape of fires into peatland areas. However, you had large El Nino events in the 1960s on this island, but this is before there was a massive settlement effort by the Indonesian government. And so there's no fires before this island was, before there's an increasing human presence on this island. And you get the opposite pattern on Sumatra, where there has been a human settlement for many, many decades. And so you can see the relationship of El Nino having an influence. So this is a mechanism by which the fire component would increase through time. Same thing goes in South America. There's across the deforestation frontier, where there's a lot of clearing. This is work by Luis Gilio for GFED4 burned area. We'll speak next. And you can see that there's a relatively good correspondence between fire and areas that are cleared on the edge of the forest. And so this increasing interface between tropical forests and agriculture creates an ignition source that can be modulated by climate. And so in Brazil, massive success in the dropping of the deforestation rate over the last decade, and especially high intensity deforestation. But fires have not dropped at the same rate. So if you look at GFED fire emissions, even though the deforestation rate has declined, because of this interface, the wildland-human interface, carbon emissions and their modulation, including the 2010 event, remains very strong. In terms of, there's both El Nino modulation of fires, but there's also other mechanisms, and this is an example of one modulated by the North Atlantic. So there's actually a link between hurricanes and hurricane damage and Amazon fires. And in the past, the hurricane damage would really be a truly natural disturbance process, but with human imprint in the southern Amazon, these are now synchronized. So this is sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic. When sea surface temperatures are high, you get more fires in the southern Amazon, and you get more hurricane damage to forests across Central and North America. And so the fires and hurricanes are actually correlated at a level of an R value of 0.6. Fossil fuels, the second part of my talk is really that fossil fuel gradients are increasing. And this is work looking in the community Earth system model, but these are observations. This is the TAP station in Korea, and compare that to Mauna Loa. And if you look at this, the growth rate is actually at Mauna Loa relative to South Pole is increasing faster than Mauna Loa to South Pole. So they're increasing continental gradients in fossil fuels within the Northern Hemisphere and between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And so these gradients are expected to rapidly increase with RCP 4.5 and 8.5. And so as these gradients increase and you have monsoonal variation or changes in the jet stream, it has the potential to induce variability in climate. So this is actually then looking out to 2100. If you combine, this is variability in CO2 coming from fossil fuels, land, and oceans for the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere in the Community Earth System model, BGC. And what's shown here is that actually over the 21st century, the land variability increases, in part because gross primary production increases. There's more fluxes in and out. There's more gross exchange. But fossil fuels actually contribute to the net signal just as much as land use change. The fossil fuels contribute just as much as the net land influence. And oceans have relatively little effect on these timescales. So on a different timescale than some of the recent work, which has looked at the annual growth rate and the mean annual temperature, we conducted an analysis of Mauna Loa CO2 variability and the ocean Nino index on a monthly time step. And so that's shown here. This is the ONI is in red, and the variability in CO2 at Mauna Loa is in blue. And when you look at a monthly time scale, you do not see as much evidence for a change in the growth rate over time. This is the blue is the first period. The red is the second more recent period. So if you split it apart, you can see the two regression lines. The variance in CO2 has increased with time, which is consistent with a fossil fuel, a fire, and also this net ecosystem exchange mechanism. Temperature variability has increased a little bit as well, but the phasing, the correlation between the two, has remained about the same, or it's even declined some over time. So in conclusion, the temperature influence alone is not the sole influence or sole driver of tropical ecosystem responses to climate variability. So if you if you use the full two-dimensional structure of CO2 and take advantage of that, the fact that there are pulses that go into either hemisphere and the imprint of extreme events, you find that fire and net ecosystem exchanges to drought, palmar drought stress, or precipitation together exceed the direct net ecosystem exchange responses to temperature. Agricultural expansion in tropical forests has increased fire risk and carbon emissions associated with El Nino, and the other mechanism that I showed linked with the North Atlantic AMO. Fossil fuel emissions are increasing at continental and interhemispheric gradients in CO2, and those are likely to induce more variability. And I think that's also why in the early study with Keppel-Aleks, it's possible to explain less variability in the northern hemisphere because of these fossil fuel gradients. So further work is needed to try to understand the relative importance of these direct human controls and anthropogenic controls on the CO2 growth rate. So thank you.
Okay, so we have time for one or two questions.
Thanks for a really fabulous talk. So I was just wondering, you talk about responses in terms of drought and fire. I was wondering if it was possible to look at regions of the world where rainfall might be increasing and see if you could see a dampening of fire.
I think that's a really great question. I think it hasn't really been possible before because the fire records are so short, but now with the extension of years and the longer-term records, I think it is becoming possible, and I think that's a really good idea to try to look at that. Yeah.
Anybody else?